Hello and welcome to this ICAS On Demand webinar. I'm Stephen Wood, a non-appointment taking insolvency practitioner, and I work within the practice support team here at ICAS. I'm going to take you through this webinar, which is really just quite a high-level look at findings in relation to ICAS insolvency monitoring visits that were conducted during 2021 and 2022. So just by way of a very brief introduction, ICAS is a recognised professional body, RPB, responsible for regulating ICAS licensed insolvency practitioners or IPs in the UK. The RPBs are in turn regulated by the Insolvency Service, which has overall responsibility on behalf of the Secretary of State for Business and Trade, ensuring that the activities of the RPBs that authorise and licence IPs are in line with regulatory objectives. As most watching this webinar will be aware, since 2019, ICAS has entered into a formal agreement to subcontract the resourcing of on-site monitoring visits to ICAEW. The visits are carried out by ICAEW monitoring staff with reports prepared for ICAS. The processes and procedures undertaken are the same as would have been the case with ICAS insolvency monitoring staff, including the report review process. ICAS has retained full responsibility, including quality control of the work undertaking and taking regulatory action where appropriate. And as I've already mentioned, this webinar reflects findings from visits conducted through 2021 and 2022. So you can see the results of the 2021 and 2022 monitoring visits on the slide there. There were a total of 41 visits and 20 of those, so virtually 50%, had serious issues identified. There's no real way of sugarcoating those findings. They're obviously very disappointing and a cause for some concern. There were 15 visits with no follow-up issues, 1 with some issues, and 5 with systemic issues. I've not included the figures for previous years here. You can see them in the 2020 monitoring report, which is on the ICAS website if you're so inclined. But I should imagine these figures don't compare favourably at all with recent years. I think only 12% of the 19 visits were noted as having serious issues in 2020. And in each of the 4 years preceding that, more than 70% of the visits conducted were coming back with no follow-up issues. So there clearly has been quite a significant deterioration in outcomes. What the reason is for that is not entirely clear, and comparisons can be difficult due to a different population being reviewed each year. However, as I alluded to in my introduction, there has been a change in our monitoring in terms of ICAEW carrying out the actual visits. We've also gone through COVID, and there might still be a hangover from the problems everyone encountered during that period. And it's also a challenging regulatory backdrop for IPs generally, with far more considerations than there ever have been when taking on an insolvency appointment. Also, anecdotally, there may be a number of firms struggling slightly with staffing issues. So there's probably a whole host of reasons for the outcome figures, but the bare facts don't make great reading, and a lot of the issues are really in areas that would be considered as the basics and fundamentals of insolvency work. So there's obviously work to be done for a number of our firms. So moving on to the key themes arising from the visits, and you'll see there a graph that gives you details of the percentage of visits where certain issues were encountered during the years under review. So some of the key themes are things like statutory filing issues and deadlines being missed, AML deficiencies and delays, case progression issues generally, along with specific issues like late or unjustifiably delayed dividends. Also, inadequate ethical considerations, GDPR, a lack of SIP2 investigations, including a failure to secure books and records. Crucially, an absence of evidence to support work done, which is probably a theme that feeds into some of the other issues, in that they could possibly be justified or explained if actions had simply been documented on file. Then we have SIP 11 cashiering reviews and SIP 3.1 and 3.3 procedures, obviously concerning IVAs and trustees respectively. Pension checks, so generally not carrying out checks or an over-reliance on Section 120 searches. And finally, a lack of verification of employee claims for the purposes of submission of information to the Redundancy Payment Service, or a failure to submit an HR1 form and consult in relation to redundancies. Although that last one is quite a low number and I don't think is reflective of a wider issue. So that's a flavour of some of the issues that are being encountered. In the next slide, I'll go on to look at what has been found in relation to some of those areas in a little bit more detail. As I said in the introduction, this webinar isn't really about providing training in these areas. This is really just about presenting the findings at this stage, in the hope that that starts conversations within firms and encourages RIPs to look at their processes. However, we do intend to cover best practice in some of these areas in sessions at the Insolvency Conference later in the year. The booking for that is open, and I'll come back to provide a bit more information on it at the end of this webinar. So moving on to a bit more of the detail behind some of the findings, I've grouped filings, deadlines, case progression issues and late dividends together, as they all essentially come back to the same thing in terms of control of cases. So as it says there, this isn't just restricted to minor issues. You know, a circular sent a day late on a couple of cases. There have been instances of cases remaining open without the awareness of the IP, for example, which is clearly quite worrying. You'll see from there a quote from our monitor saying dividend delays of 34 months, which has materially prejudiced creditors, and a lack of case progression generally is a repeated issue, and in some cases to the detriment of creditors, which is obviously when it becomes more serious from a regulatory perspective. The dividend delays issues is an interesting one, and I think might be something which is a bit of a Scottish specific issue, in that there has traditionally been a culture of paying dividends other than perhaps to secured and pref creditors at the conclusion of the case, when absolutely everything else is finalised, and it's really the last major piece of work that's being undertaken. And obviously dividends should be paid at earliest a point as possible. However, as I mentioned during the last slide, an absence of evidence to support work done is always a theme for monitoring visits, not just in the last couple of years. So it may be that some of the dividend delays alluded to could be justified, maybe due to the IP being uncomfortable in paying out when considering possible investigations to be undertaken, etc. But the evidence on file simply doesn't show any consideration around the issue, just the absence of a dividend. When reviewing it cold years down the line, there is no reason apparent for not paying one. I think the mindset to be in at every accounting period is to take a starting point of, okay, I'm going to pay a dividend, have that at the forefront of your mind, and if you're not going to pay one, narrate why, but start from the point of view of aiming to pay a dividend and not the other way around. AML, I've put in quite large text there a few times because it is a recurring theme, and one that, it has to be said, is by no means restricted to ICAS IPs. So some of the quotes from the monitors include no AML training, not AML supervised, AML deficiencies and delays. So it's not just one thing, it's possibly lack of AML supervision. And as a reminder, you need to ensure that the firm you are either leading or employed within is subject to AML supervision by one of the supervisory bodies. If any IP is unsure of who the AML supervisor is for their firm or has any questions in that area, contact our regulatory authorisations colleagues, who will be more than happy to help. But beyond that, you need to ensure your staff are fully trained. It is not just you, it's everyone involved in the process. And generally, you have to have appropriate AML procedures and practices in place for dealing with your insolvency appointments. There are loads of resources out there. So there's the money laundering regulations themselves that you should be familiar with. Then, most importantly, the CCAB AML and counter-terrorist financing guidance for the accountancy sector 2022, and in particular Appendix F, which is supplementary guidance for insolvency practitioners. Then there's the ICAS AML supervision report for 1st of April 2021 to 5th of April 2022, which is available on the website, along with a whole host of AML resources, including the ICAS General Practice Manual, which contains help sheets on things like tipping off, suspicious activity reporting, client due diligence, etc., and a whole host of specimen documents for risk assessments. I've also published fairly recently a Q&A article covering some of the recurring AML related queries we've received from our IP community. So if you go to icas.com/insolvency, you'll find that there. And I would say on a general note, and again, this isn't restricted to insolvency practitioners, firms really need to review their AML processes. It's a huge regulatory focus across the board, and it isn't going to go away. It's clearly a very important area, and one everyone quite rightly has a responsibility to ensure that they are not inadvertently facilitating criminal activity. I think the mindset that may persist with some is that AML is an adjunct to insolvency work and is of less importance. It's treated as a bit of a tick box exercise and doesn't, in their mind, form part of the core insolvency work. And I think that's a mindset that has to change. As I say, it's not going to go away. It's here to stay. And if you fall foul of the regulations, I think it's going to increasingly become an issue for your firm. Moving on to SIP 2 investigations, those were highlighted as deficient in a number of cases. So you'll see there lack of investigations, lack of evidence of investigations, failure to secure books and records, and inappropriate attempts to made to secure records. For this issue, possibly more than the others, it's possible that there is a slight COVID legacy to some of the findings. But in any event, SIP 2 obviously sets out best practice for investigations by liquidators and administrators with key compliance standards that should be met in every case, and assessments that should take place, notwithstanding any shortage of funds. In some of these cases, it may be that assessments were made, further steps considered, but not taken for good and cogent reasons. However, as touched on earlier, and it's a point that seems to recur, if the documentation isn't there, then it doesn't allow the monitoring reviewer to understand at a later date the extent, nature and timing of the work that was undertaken. The work undertaken in course of action taken may have been entirely appropriate, but if the work if that work and course are insufficiently narrated, then you're going to hit problems when it comes to a monitoring review, or if you're having to justify a course of action to our investigations team who are dealing with a complaint, and that is something I know the investigations team come across on a fairly regular basis. It really comes back to paragraph 7 of SIP 1. Insolvency practitioners should evidence their compliance with SIPs and should therefore document their strategies and decision-making processes appropriately. And if you take nothing else from this webinar, please bear that in mind. Next up, SIP 11 cashiering reviews. Probably a bit of a surprise, as the appropriate handling of funds is obviously fundamental to an insolvency appointment. However, the monitors have identified instances where the controls in place have either not been adequate or do not cover all relevant requirements when handling funds. So matters mentioned include the lack of an annual review, despite the requirement being enforced since 1st of January 2018. That's a reference to paragraph 11 of SIP 11, which sets out that financial controls and safeguards should be reviewed at a minimum annually. The ICAS General Practice Manual does in fact contain a document entitled Insolvency Funds Compliance Review, which is aimed at being used for that type of review. Also, lack of evidence of regular bank reconciliations. So SIP 11 requires regular reconciliation of estate and client accounts. However, it's also worth stating that estate money held by insolvency practitioners licensed by ICAS is included within the definition of client's money for the purpose of the ICAS client's money regulations. Those regulations stipulate that reconciliation exercises must be conducted at least once every 5 weeks. So we'd obviously encourage IPs to review both the requirements of SIP 11 and the client money regs to determine if the controls they have in place are adequate, because it's clearly a very important area and one where if things are not done correctly, they can have pretty serious implications. On ethics, there are some quite general points in terms of not complying with the new code and not conducting training or introducing procedures for the new code requirements. As a reminder, we adopted a revised Code of Ethics with effect from 1st of January 2022 to incorporate the International Ethics Standards Boards for Accountants, ISBA, revisions to promote the role, mindset and behavioural characteristics expected of all professional accountants. Part 5 of the Code of Ethics applicable to IPs wasn't amended. However, ICAS IPs should be aware that parts 1 and 3 of the main code set out the general position which should be applied. Part 5 amplifies the fundamental principles and provides additional material specifically applicable to IPs, but the main code takes precedence. Also, from 1st of January 2021, compulsory ethics CPD was introduced for all ICAS members, and there are myriad resources available on our website. Checks not done in a timely manner and incomplete, so essentially not addressing or identifying all of the threats, was also noted as an issue. Similar to AML, that might again be as a result of treating ethical considerations as a bit of a tick box exercise instead of adopting the inquiring mindset required by the code and exercising appropriate professional judgment, and again narrating that judgment. In amongst those general points, some examples of matters encountered include an individual who referred a case to an IP being appointed as a commissioner and subsequently approving the IP's remuneration, which raised concerns about a conflict of interest, whether actual or perceived, likely with reference to the reasonable and informed third-party tests set out in the code. There were also concerns over an IP's control of cases when using third parties to fulfil certain obligations, and a breach of requirement 2000.10 was raised, which is about IPs ensuring that work for which they are responsible, which is undertaken by members of the insolvency team on their behalf, is carried out in accordance with the requirements of the code. Finally, a breach of the code was noted in one case where an IP continued to accept cases knowing that the banking arrangements they had in place would not allow estate monies to be segregated. So a number of issues there in terms of SIP 11 and the client's money regs, but also very much from an ethical perspective. With GDPR, the general finding that was most frequently raised is that IPs are failing to document considerations in relation to data subjects like debtors and employees, so failing to identify what data is held and whether and how to ensure that it is GDPR compliant. There were also some IPs whose firms had not registered with the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO. So as a reminder, any business, organisation or sole trader that is processing personal data, unless exempt, has to register with the ICO and pay the data protection fee so that they appear on the ICO's register. The fee is pretty minimal for most small and medium-sized businesses, and certainly a lot more affordable than an ICO fine. And finally, there was an instance of individual employee information being filed at Companies House with the monitoring reviewer noting that the IP failed to contact the ICO to report as a possible data breach. And again, as a reminder, if there is a possible personal data breach, you must notify the ICO without undue delay and, where feasible, not later than 72 hours after becoming aware of the breach. Finally, employee claims. The first one in relation to delays was, I think, just in relation to one case, so quite an isolated incident and a fairly self-explanatory. The majority of issues were in relation to a lack of supporting evidence for RP14A submissions. So a failure to verify the employee claims against payroll records before submitting RP14A, and also submission of RP14A without the monitors finding anything on file to corroborate the figures. I think in that case it is more likely to be that the IP was unable to secure any records, and the issue is probably more to do with them failing to adequately make the redundancy payment service aware that the forms have been completed from employee information due to a lack of payroll records. So if you look at DIP 117, it provides an email address for any relevant information not included in the RP14 and 14A. So obviously make them aware of the full circumstances if you haven't already done so, so that they are fully appraised of all relevant information before they start paying out on claims. So that's it in terms of what I'm going to cover at the moment. That was just quite a brief run through, really intended to present the headline findings. As I mentioned earlier, the ICAS Insolvency and Restructuring Conference is going to expand on some of these topics with some members of our Insolvency Committee taking a look at best practice in a few of those areas. So it will be well worth a look for anyone looking for some pointers in that connection. It's again going to be a virtual event this year. It's free to attend and will be held on the mornings of the 19th and 20th of September. It'll be once again hosted by Shona Campbell, partner at Henderson Logie and chair of our Insolvency Committee, and will feature favourites such as Stuart Clubb and James Lloyd with their usual corporate and personal insolvency legal updates respectively. Just go to icas.com/events and you'll find the registration link to book your place. And please remember that you can keep up to date with all the latest insolvency and other professional news, including latest information, guides and resources through icas.com. You can access technical support through the ICAS Technical Help Desk, which covers audit and accounting, tax, practice support, AML and ethics. And that's it from me. Thank you very much for watching.